Hi, and welcome to the Friday, May 3rd lessons. Unfortunately, guys, I could not be there today. I have an appointment. Um, so, with that being said, I wanted to sort of help and support you by going over some instructions through this video. All right, so let's start off with a reminder that the Science Fair report draft is due Monday at the start of class, meaning you do not have Monday's class to work on it, meaning that this is the last class that you will be together with your Science Fair group members to work on it. So you definitely want to take that in consideration and make sure you make today as productive as possible. But before we continue with the instructions, it may be a good idea to sort of go through what's due so you have a sense of like, hey, this is a lot of work, or this is something that we definitely can get done today, and that will help with your productivity. Okay, so these are the sections, the highlight section of the sections that are due in the draft: the title, your names, your question, variables, hypothesis, background, materials, and safety. Let's go through each so we have a sense of exactly what we need to put in. First one, title. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's the title of your project. You want to make the title catchy, so it catches the reader or the viewer's attention, but also it must be relevant to your question. Next, you have the first and last names of all group members. So where it says researchers' names, I need everyone's first and last name that's in your science fair group. Question is your science fair question. Make sure that your experiment and variables will answer the question. Sometimes the two don't match. Like you could have a question that you wrote the question down initially, but then as you planned out the experiment and what you were going to do, that sort of changed your question, but you never went back and changed it. So you want to make sure that it's going to match what you're doing. Now let's go into the variables. There are three types of variables, and for the rest of this, I'm going to usually refer back to the example that you looked at in your first in your project proposal, which is which chocolate chips make the best chocolate chip cookies. So that's what I'll refer to just sort of help you better understand what each section is required. Okay, so going back to the variables. For this part of the draft, there are three variables. The independent, which is the thing you change. So in that example, it would be the chocolate chips. The dependent is what you measure as a result of that change. So in the example, it will be the flavor rating that was given for each cookie made with the different chocolate chips. And then finally, the control is a thing that you want to keep the same. So in this case, it would be the same recipe. Now, typically for the independent variable, there's usually only one. Sometimes there are two. Dependent, same thing. It's usually only one. Sometimes there's two. It depends on the complexity of your experiment. More complicated ones will have more than one. But there usually aren't that many independent or dependent variables, just one or two. Controls, however, I only have one here, but really there should be more. So usually with your control variables, you're usually having to do at least three or four, because those are like whatever factor that you can come up with that could influence the dependent variable. You want to make sure you keep those the same so they do not influence the dependent variable. And the only thing that's influencing the dependent variable is your independent variable. So that's something to keep in mind. So independent and dependent, one or two variables probably listed there. Controlled, we're looking at three, four, sometimes more. Let's go into the hypothesis. Hypothesis is an educated guess that should answer your question. And the key word there is educated. So educated means you need to back it up with some sort of science or some sort of research. So when you're listing your hypothesis and you're saying like, we believe this will happen, you also have to state why, and the why must be backed up in science. This is where the background section is super helpful, because when you are preparing your background section, one major part of your background section is the science behind your project. So when you're preparing that section, you are working towards this, and it will help you with your hypothesis. So if you've written your hypothesis already, and as you're doing your background section research, if you start to think something differently, make sure you go and modify that, because you don't want to have a hypothesis that doesn't make sense or doesn't match what you've sort of put in your background. Okay, now let's go into the background section. I want to sort of show you how the background section probably will be structured. I'm not looking for a certain number of paragraphs. I'm just looking that you're hitting certain key things and that these ideas are well fleshed out. So most likely your very first paragraph in the background will discuss the why it's important. So when you are presenting any research, you want to hook your reader or your viewer with why would anyone want to do this research? Why would this be important for either greater society or just general interest, right? And so that's usually what the first paragraph is. This paragraph will require maybe a little bit of research, probably some statistics or something like that, but not a large amount of research. For example, in the chocolate chip cookie example, one way to hook the reader is by saying something like, oh, chocolate chip cookies are one of the most popular cookies. Every year people spend da 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 money. Now that's where I would do some research, figuring out how much people spend. Then the next sentence will go into, so what makes a good chocolate chip cookie? Is it the cookie or the chip? This project investigates da da da. So then my last sentence will sort of tell people this is what I'll be investigating. So a couple key things here. I did a little bit of research on how much people spend. And then I'm also putting here at the very last bit what this project is investigating. So it could be structured like this, doesn't have to be, but this is a very typical structure. Now let's go into the science behind your project. For the science behind your project, chocolate chips contain a variety of ingredients, including da 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 da. Okay, so let me just back up here. In the science behind your project, this is where you're doing the bulk of your research, and there should be scientific evidence or some sort of scientific data that sort of relates to what you're talking about. So in this case, I would talk about chocolate chips, like what makes high quality chocolate chips, and I will talk about those features and those factors as well, and the science that backs that up. So I could say something like chocolate chips contain a variety of ingredients, including, with some of those ingredients, high quality chocolate chips contain a higher fat sugar ratio, thus they melt at a lower melting point. Research shows that chocolate with a lower melting point is more desirable because. So here you can see a couple things that I've researched. One, I've researched high quality chocolate, like what makes chocolate high quality. I researched the ingredients in chocolate. I researched, why do higher quality chocolate chips could be more desirable? And it's because they have a chocolate with a lower melting point is more desirable because, and I'm sure that there will be some more information there as well. So you can see I've done a bulk of my research in this section. Once you've gone over the science behind your project, and that, by the way, the science behind your project could be 2-3 paragraphs, maybe it's just one. It depends on how much science that you need to present. So for some people, it's just very, very basic. And then for other people, there may be more required. Once you've done that, you want to go into what will your experiment test. So this is, as you recall, the background is not an area for details about your plan or procedure, but it does give people, your background should or could end with giving people a sense of what your experiment's about, because it kind of links everything together. So you can start off by saying something like, in this project, 5 types of chocolate chip cookies were prepared and rated by 10 students in a blind taste test. Each cookie was baked using the same recipe, but different chocolate chips of various qualities and price. For cookie 1, we used this chocolate chip, and list the price. For cookie 2, we did this, etc. And then cookies were rated using a 5-point scale that measures right? And then you can sort of, just giving people a general overview of what you're doing, but you're not going into details. The recipe is not presented here. Was also not presented here are the details in how you structured up the test. You didn't give any details about the 10 students, like any details that would influence their rating or anything like that. So here, just a general what your experiment will test. So that will nicely lead into the rest of your report. The last thing that you need to do after the background, which again is where you'll spend bulk of your time, is list your materials and describe any safety measures for your science fair project. So Once again, safety for some people could just be simply using a consent form. For other people's, it may be using goggles. It all kind of depends on what you're doing. Okay, so this is what you're having to prepare by Monday. And now that you have a better sense of what needs to go into the report draft, let's continue on with the instructions. So the next thing is I left comments for folks have who had some information there. If you had nothing, there was no, I couldn't leave any comment, but most people had something. So you want to make sure you read and follow those comments that I left in your draft. And by the end of today, you should be able to complete your draft, or by the least, nearly complete your draft and identify what to do next. And make sure that when you're identifying what to do next, you also know who's doing it. That way you can hold people more accountable. Finally, at the end of the day, if you have any questions that you want to give me, you can take a survey linked in this assignment, and I'll reply to your questions later on this evening. So make sure you do that by the end of the day. Group expectations. I just want to quickly go over this with you since I'm not there, and I just want to give you helpful reminders. Make sure you work with your group members only. And I say this not for my benefit or for the benefit of the subs, but really for yours. I want you guys to be successful on this. And if you are not working with your group members, you're not contributing to your project, and you're probably distracting others. So you definitely want to avoid that so you can do your best on this. Be productive. And if that means if you finish early, don't go around distracting others. Find something that else you can do that's productive and not distracting. You could also just continue working on other parts of your science fair project as well. Remember, your goal is to complete this or nearly complete it. So let's aim for that goal today. And now it's time to get into science fair group work time. When you get there, when you head to your group, make sure you open up your draft document. That should be the first thing you're doing, is opening up that draft document in Google Classroom or in your or linked in your email. Read and follow the comments that I left, and remember, aim to complete this before you leave. That way you don't have to worry about this over the weekend. All right, good luck, folks. Have a quality weekend.